South Africa's economy has gone through similar economic cycles over the past 40 years. Data from the World Bank reveals periods of economic growth followed by sharp contractions as long ago as 1987. This highlights the importance of the government taking lessons from economic cycles of the past to make better budgetary decisions in the future. A Business Live feature by Yanni Rousseau, a Wits Business School professor and former currency specialist at the Reserve Bank between 1986 and 2012, illustrates the intricate balancing act policymakers often face between adhering to fiscal policy and responding to urgent social needs. He gives the example of how the political pressure weighing on then Finance Minister Barend du Plessis in 1988 mirrors some of the complications faced by the current finance minister, despite the economy being structured very differently. When the 1980s under apartheid rule served a small group of citizens compared to a democracy with a growing population, there are economic patterns that persist. In the 1970s, the country's economy was driven by gold exports, with that revenue trickling into the 1980s. Fast forward to a decade after the dawn of democracy, and the country once again benefited from the commodities boom in the early 2000s. Over both periods, the government seemingly struggled to turn those mini economic booms into sustainable growth to support future budgets. In the 1980s, the country had soaring debt levels and interest rate repayments that came at a huge expense to the economy. As the gold revenue started to dry out and the impact of economic sanctions started to be felt, money also started flowing out of the economy as foreign banks froze credit to the country and businesses closed shop or moved abroad. This was while the small tax base struggled in a high inflation rate environment and unemployment started to spiral out of control. The cost of maintaining the apartheid government also became too high due to high administrative costs, issues that sound all too familiar in the country's current economic climate. While the government did have a cool-down period between 1984 and 1986, largely due to the International Monetary Fund demanding austerity measures for highly indebted African and Latin American countries, the cuts in spending were too little too late to reserve losses fueled by intensifying anti-apartheid protests and a striking labor force. According to BR Impumelelo Economic Growth Labs, the South African economy needs to grow at 3% or more to boost business and consumer confidence as well as curb unemployment. However, this requires policy reforms and fiscal policy modeling for this to happen. Whether the government does draw lessons from the past to craft budgets for a better future remains to be seen. For Newzroom Afrika on Channel 405, I'm Dogozo Khumalo in Johannesburg.